Hello, my name is Craig Cashwell, and I'm a professor of counselor education at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and in private practice as a CSAT supervisor.
And I'm Marnie Ferree. I direct a faith-based clinical program in Nashville, Tennessee called Bethesda Workshops, doing frontline 4-day intensive treatment for sex addicts and partners and couples.
Our presentation was entitled A Twisting of the Sacred, and it was primarily focused on clergy sexual misconduct. And we really wanted to focus on the struggle of clergy, but also really wanted to help our audience understand the impact that this has on the victims and on the congregation. And so we work to treat all of these groups and individuals with great compassion, but also really wanting to help people understand the depth of not only the physical impact, but also the spiritual impact when this occurs.
And Craig, we talked so much about this topic and about our passions that we both bring to the topic, our particular interest. I know we talked about that the old model was when this happened of clergy sexual abuse, and we're talking about adults, we're not talking about children in our presentation, that the focus went on the offender and all of the resources went to the offender, and he was often whisked off, perhaps taken to treatment, and often sent down the road without any particular consequences, because it was assumed that he had contact with a consenting adult. Mm-hmm. And the way the paradigm somewhat is, and certainly needs to shift, to put all the emphasis on the support of the victim. Can you tell us, though, something about the offender and about what puts that person at risk?
Yeah. So we certainly have a lot of compassion for the clergy member who becomes a perpetrator. Being a clergy member is a very difficult position. There's a lot of isolation.
Right.
There's often sort of an elevation of that individual. They're sort of not seen as just a human. They're often elevated. And as we've talked about, part of the struggle is that then sometimes the abuser becomes conflated with God. And that creates a real spiritual issue for the victim. But there's a tremendous amount of role strain for clergy. There's a lot of isolation. They're often always they're the caretaker, they're the healer, and yet there's no one there quite for them. And in fact, they're not expected to have needs, psychological, spiritual, or sexual needs, because they're seen as being kind of above that. And so they're in a really difficult situation, often without a lot of support and without go-to people. They often can't go to the other leadership. If they have a larger faith community would have a larger leadership team, but that's probably not a safe place to talk about some of these struggles. And we know that a lot of pastors have a lot of sexual desire for people in their congregation. Right. We would say, well, that's okay, that's normal. It's normal to be attracted to someone or to find someone attractive. The boundary crossing doesn't occur until, of course, the behaviors are engaged. And so while we are focused primarily on the victims and the religious community and the impact, I think both you and I still have a lot of compassion for perpetrators and their need to get treatment and their need to get help and support for their struggles.
Sure. And I think another factor in this is that a clergy person has unlimited, very intimate access into the lives of the congregants. I mean, this is the only person who could show up at 2 a.m. with the emergency, the only person who would receive a call in the middle of the night. And intersecting with people's lives, it's such precious and tender and sacred and theologically important moments. Births and confirmation or baptism of children and marriages and funerals and memorial services and crisis that people are facing, often a marital crisis. The first person they'll go to is their pastor. And so it creates this unbelievable imbalance of power. And part of that is theological, because so many people believe that whatever the pastor, and we're using that pastor term, any type of clergy person, rabbi, priest, in any type of spiritual authority, has their word and their behavior carries such weight. And so it creates a vulnerability in congregants and in victims, which are primarily women, that cannot be underestimated.
Maybe I wonder if you would talk a little bit about, because I know you've done a lot of this work around how you see the impact of the victim and why it's so profound.
It is unbelievably profound for some of those reasons that I just mentioned, because it not only shatters the victim in terms of sexually, because often these individuals, they know that sex, at some level, they know that sex with a clergy person is out of bounds. And yet, through the grooming process, through all of the very manipulative, even theological process, oh, God put you in my life. God knew that I needed someone to affirm and comfort me, and you are now that person. All of that kind of stuff is so confusing sexually for the victim, who, by the way, rarely sees herself as a victim in the beginning. She sees herself as an affair partner. But then it's so impactful spiritually, because this person has tainted different parts of her spiritual life and often her very view of God.
You know, I know too, the thing that I see sometimes is then added on to that is that secondary trauma of often being blamed, either by the church leadership or by the congregation at large. And then, of course, you have the challenge then of what the individual does with that, because they're in this time of great stress and turmoil in their life, and the very community that has offered them the most support in many cases is no longer available to them.
That's exactly right. And we spoke in our presentation at length about the church leadership response, which unfortunately is usually abysmal. It's usually horribly, horribly damaging to the victim and to the church. You're exactly right. The church often blames the victim. Well, she was an adult. You know, she perhaps was seductive. She was wounded or vulnerable, and forget that that actually makes her more in need of protection rather than more culpable. And the church leadership often, who themselves, by the way, are secondary victims. This clergy person has betrayed their trust, so they're in shock and denial, and they've called this person into ministry and ordained him and believed in him and trusted him and given him all this power and authority. So they often are kind of doubly ill-equipped. They don't have the training, and theologically they often believe, well, we can just handle this within our theological framework. We'll extend grace, we'll forgive, we'll allow redemptive practices, which are horrible for both the congregation and the victim. And they often do such a horrible job with disclosure. You talked yesterday about disclosure.
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that often is done is that the offending pastor is actually asked to make the disclosure to the faith community, and they're in no way, shape, or form psychologically ready to do that. And so they're often minimizing and defending and maybe blaming the victim and dissembling and rationalizing, and it's just not good for anyone. It's not good for the pastor, it's not good for the victim, it's not good for the church leadership, it's not good for the community at large.
Exactly. I call that spiritual incest. This person that the congregation has loved is now often in this very broken state and crying and doing all the things you just described, and it's so confusing. We focused on the victims too.
Yeah, so when we, you know, it's always interesting to me, one of the struggles, what comes up for me as you say that, one of the struggles in religious communities is that appropriately there's an emphasis on forgiveness, right? That is a very deep spiritual practice of forgiveness. And yet sometimes religious communities really don't understand the psychological process of forgiveness, and they make it an event or an act that happens in a moment as opposed to a process. And we as therapists know it's a process that sometimes takes a great deal of time to work through. And so I think that's one of the messages that comes up that I think can be particularly problematic. We need to immediately forgive this person when in fact that's just not psychologically sane.
Exactly. And I know one of the things we so want the clinical community, or if church leaders happen to be watching this tape, to know that it is always the clergy person's responsibility to maintain boundaries.
Yes.
That's an important takeaway. It is always an abuse of power and clergy sexual abuse, and never a consensual affair, even though the victim will feel like that's been an affair. And I think a third takeaway is that church leadership, and then we as CSATs and trained clinicians, must insist that the church and this offender and this victim and all the families get adequate help, which is not going to be found within the church itself.
That's right. There's that tendency to spiritualize the healing process, and there can be a spiritual component to that process, but there's a lot of psychological work that also needs to be done.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So we're very grateful to have been able to provide this presentation and hope that this information is useful to you. Thank you.